From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. First, the headlines. 56 killed and over 190 injured in mosque attack in Peshawar, Pakistan. Fire at Europe's largest nuclear plant under control as Russia takes over. U.S. House passes resolution supporting Ukraine. White House asks for $10 billion in aid. Head of UN mission tells Security Council world must engage with Taliban to save Afghanistan. Children face mental health issues in Indian-administered Kashmir as schools reopen after 2 years. Russian television finds new home on MAGA YouTube COPYCAT channel. And our top story tonight. A suicide bomber blew himself up during weekly Friday prayers at a Shia mosque in northwestern Pakistan, killing at least 56 people and injuring over 190 others. Police Superintendent Harun Rashid said the attacker was stopped by police at a mosque in Peshawar's bustling Qissa Khani Bazaar. But he forced his way into the mosque's main hall. The city borders the area in Afghanistan where ISIS operates. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack. Europe's largest nuclear power plant was on fire Friday after Russian strikes hit the Ukrainian facility, a spokesman said. Russia is now in control of the plant as it intensifies strikes across the country. There are fresh reports of civilian casualties and devastating damage. That despite Moscow's agreeing to Ukraine's request for humanitarian corridors to allow terrified residents to flee conflict areas. There was no sign of any move towards a ceasefire, with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky urging the West to step up military assistance and provide planes. U.S. Senator Ed Markey released a joint statement of the U.S. Congress Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group, which he co-chairs. It condemns President Putin's threats to escalate a conflict of his own creation into nuclear war. The statement calls on the United States, Russia, and all nuclear powers to back a no-first-use nuclear policy. This is in order to ensure that the crisis in Ukraine or any other conflicts involving nuclear-armed states do not escalate into a nuclear war. The UN Children's Agency, UNICEF, said 500,000 children have already fled Ukraine to neighboring countries, with a growing number of refugees. Poland's border guard said more than 600,000 people had crossed over. The UN expects that more than 10 million people may flee their homes if violence continues, including 4 million people who may cross border to neighboring countries. The Biden administration is offering temporary protected status to Ukrainians who have been living in the U.S. without documentation. Russia and Ukraine agreed Thursday to create humanitarian corridors for civilians fleeing intensifying fighting. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Moscow's troop advancement was going according to plan and schedule. The European Union offered immediate protection status to millions of Ukrainian nationals and long-term residents seeking refuge in the EU as of February 24th. But nearly everyone else, such as foreign students from Africa in Ukraine, are not covered. Some foreign students say they have watched as Ukrainian pets crossed the border to safety while they were blocked from leaving Ukraine. It all comes down to black and white, said Mohammed, an Indian medical student speaking from a hostel in Lviv on Tuesday. Mohammed, originally from New Delhi, said he and hundreds of foreign students have been denied passage at the Polish border and forced to return to the city 40 miles away. Young Fridays for Future climate campaigners took to the streets worldwide on Thursday to stand with the people of Ukraine. They called for a world that prioritizes peace and freedom from fossil fuels for all. They criticized people for ignoring wars in South Sudan, Iraq, Nigeria, and many other southern regions affected by imperialist and fossil fuel wars during the last decade. The group stressed that while Ukrainians deserve peace and support, so do the people of Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and other war-torn regions. Member of the youth-led movement carried signs reading "Stand with Ukraine" and "No more wars." Its members generally hold school strikes on Fridays inspired by Swedish teenager and climate activist Greta Thunberg. The U.S. House of Representatives passed a bipartisan resolution Wednesday supporting Ukraine and calling for a ceasefire amid Russia's war. It cleared the House floor with a 426-3 vote. Republican Representatives Paul Gosar of Arizona, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, and Matt Rosendale of Montana cast the only opposing votes. The non-binding resolution also calls for the full withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory and backs continued use of sanctions. Meanwhile, the White House requested $10 billion in U.S. aid Thursday to help Ukraine and Central European partners with humanitarian efforts, security, and economic assistance. Bringing more news stories after the break from around the globe and the United States. Stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Imam Malik Mujahid in Chicago. Just like you, I was moved by that Allahu Akbar lady. She stood her ground, fearful of none, for her hijab and for her education. Sisters and brothers, Indian Muslims are facing a genocide. India does not care for Muslim protesting, but it does care for the world opinion. Therefore, we must push the United Nations. The UN has a responsibility to protect. They must prevent genocide. Please sign this UN petition now. Get others to sign. It will help. Trust me, it will help. We need 1 million signatures, brothers and sisters. Please sign now.
Welcome back. Lawyers for 4 families in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of occupied East Jerusalem said on Thursday that Ottoman and Jordanian documents prevented Israel's top court from enforcing eviction orders. The Israeli Supreme Court decision was unprecedented, lawyers said. They added they will continue efforts to prove Palestinian families own the land. The court said that the 4 families can stay in their homes until Israel conducts a land arrangement. That process could take years or may not be carried out at all. Lawyer Hosni Abu Hussein said the court reviewed documents presented by Palestinian families because of social media activism and political pressure. Schools in Indian-administered Kashmir reopened on Wednesday after 31 months. Health professionals say mental health issues amongst children spiked during this period. Schools were first closed down due to the security situation arising from India's revocation of Kashmir's limited autonomy in August 2019 and re-invasion. They remained closed later due to the restrictions imposed to curb the spread of COVID-19. So far, the pandemic has killed over 4,000 people in the region, according to health officials. Mohammed Shaheen, an occupational therapist, said many children with excessive disorders were treated during this period. Isolation and the lack of schools, recreational activities, and contact with friends has led to the spike in anxieties and depression amongst children, he said. Deborah Lyons, head of the UN mission in Afghanistan, said 6 months of indecision is eroding vital social and economic coping systems, pushing the Afghan population into greater uncertainty. As the Secretary General's Special Representative, Lyons thanked donors for humanitarian contributions since last August. That's when the last U.S. forces left Afghanistan after nearly 2 decades of war. Lyons said that the worst possible outcome, famine and widespread starvation during winter, has been averted because of humanitarian support. However, she told UN Council members humanitarian relief isn't the same as giving hope to the Afghan people or building a strong foundation for self-reliance. Russian state-owned news channel RT found a new host after being dropped by TV distributors who sought to stop the spread of propaganda about the Ukraine invasion. In a tweet sent early Thursday, the network sent a link to its new home, Rumble, a social media platform that has become popular with Republicans over the last 2 years, according to Forbes magazine. Its caption was, "RT gets ready to rumble," after a multitude of platforms have moved to knock off our broadcast and limit social media. TV distributors in the US and Europe announced plans to stop airing RT following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its misinformation campaign to justify the aggression. Rumble has previously received investment from pro-Trump venture capitalists Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance. A Texas Republican congressman apologized and dropped his bid for re-election after it was revealed that he had an affair with a British woman previously married to an ISIS leader. Congressman Van Taylor, who planned to seek a 3rd term in the U.S. House of Representatives, in an email to supporters acknowledged he made a horrible mistake about a year ago. He admitted to having an affair that has caused deep hurt and pain amongst those he loves the most in this world. Taylor called it the greatest failure of his life. A right-wing website exposed his infidelity last Sunday before Tuesday's primary. The Atlantic has called the British woman in question, Tanya Joya, the First Lady of ISIS. A Kentucky jury on Thursday acquitted Brett Hankinson of all 3 counts of felony wanton endangerment in the botched raid that left Breonna Taylor dead. The former Louisville Metro Police Department detective was the only officer charged in connection with the March 2020 shooting. The charges were not for Taylor's death. Hankinson, 45, was tried for firing bullets through Taylor's apartment window and sliding a glass door that went into a neighboring home where 3 people were present. The defense argued Hankinson acted to defend fellow officers, including one who had been shot during the chaotic situation. Hankinson's attorney, Stuart Matthews, said his client was doing his job during the shooting. Once the verdict came down after 3 hours of jury deliberations, Matthews said justice was done. U.S. Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Michigan called Islamophobia in Congress a bipartisan affair. She suggested that in addition to Republicans, some of her Democratic colleagues hold bigoted views about Muslims. In a New York Times profile, Tlaib reflected on her time in Congress and how her identity as a Palestinian Muslim woman shaped her experiences in ways she hadn't anticipated. She talked about encountering subtle and blatant bigotry when she and Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota first arrived in Congress in 2019. Tlaib told the Times she was naive and didn't understand how bipartisan Islamophobia is in Congress. Tlaib and Omar were the first Muslim women elected to Congress. In a victory for American Muslims, Sheikh YASSIR FAZAGA gets a unanimous official win in a landmark Supreme Court case that directly impacts civil rights infringements by the FBI on American Muslims. There's more work to do, but the Supreme Court win opens a lot of doors to fight back against government overreach and persecution of American Muslims, said Danish Siddiqui, chair of MuslimMatters.org, a global Muslim media platform. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
I am what hunger looks like in America.
I am an 8-year-old girl who's not excited for the last day of school. Because this may be the last time I'll have lunch. Till September.
I am a single father of 2 who works 3 part-time jobs,
and that's still not enough to put food on the table.
I was created by artificial intelligence from faces of the 1 in 8 Americans who struggle with hunger.
Feeding America, 200 food banks strong.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
To discuss the current situation of Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact of sanctions against Russia, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid in Chicago. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. More than 1 million Ukrainians have fled to Europe. And United Nations this morning is saying that the number could rise to 10 millions. 4 million to different parts of Europe and 6 million within Ukraine. So war is going on. So what the world is doing? It seems like small arms are being provided by different NATO countries to Ukraine to defend themselves against the Russian invasion. But more or less it is limited to sanctions. Sanctions and more sanctions and counter sanctions by Russia. Do sanctions really work? Can they bring peace? We have some question, and someone who dwells on these issues, a professor emeritus of the Peace Studies at the Grant Institute of International Peace Studies, George Lopez, is with us. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you today.
So, Professor, it is interesting to see there is someone who is a professor of peace studies in our country.
Well, thank you. We've been very fortunate at the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame to have generous benefactors believe that it's important to invest in research and teaching in peace. And since we opened in 1986, we have over 4,000 graduates of our program at the master's and undergraduate level, including dozens in Ukraine and Russia who we've been in touch with about this terrible tragedy.
So are there people, some of your graduates are trying to achieve peace at this moment? Because it seems like war and people supporting Ukraine with the arms and things like that. We thought United Nations, where Russia and America both are there, is an instrument of peace.
Not this time around, it seems. Unfortunate organization of the Security Council, which gives the veto to a single power when all the rest are willing to go along with the condemnation of illegal violations of borders, prevents UN Security Council action, at least at that council level. I think it's instructive that the council did mobilize one of the few rubrics that doesn't demand full agreement of the P5 and voted to move the debate and the discussion in international law terms to the General Assembly. So on Wednesday, the General Assembly passed a resolution with 141 nations condemning Russian actions and demanding an immediate withdrawal from Ukraine. And that was a very strong action. The Secretary General has been strong about this. There are ways in which the Security Council still suffers from the design of 1945. But there are elements here that might bring peace after we can stop the fighting.
So, Professor Lopez, sanctions, pretty quickly, people are just piling up sanctions after sanctions. Do you think they will bring peace?
Well, my own hope originally weeks ago was that by being transparent in the side of the Western countries with the kinds of measures that we be imposed on Russia's leadership, its oligarchs, and its economy, that a kind of more rational choice might have been made by Mr. Putin in seeing that there might be ways to work out your concerns about Ukraine, however manufactured they may be on your side, to forego this kind of military confrontation and the economic repercussions it would have due to the sanctions. But he went ahead anyway, thinking that maybe the West wasn't as united as it has turned out to be, and thinking that they had ways in which they have evaded the worst impact of sanctions before, and he could forestall the worst of this. I think sanctions have moved from the possibility of deterring us from war and preserving peace for a while to now being the economic equivalent of making war on Russia and a way to eventually get a ceasefire. But sanctions are clearly right now in a punishment mode, not in a let us bring peace mode. I think there's some hope that the sanctions will be so immediately clear and devastating that the Russian leadership might agree to a ceasefire. But I also believe that the devastation we're seeing and the loss on both sides, most of it unanticipated on the Russian side, now create a determination in the Russian leadership that they're going to forge ahead, they're going to take over Ukraine, and then they'll worry about talk and sanctions implications later.
So, sanctions were substantial, almost complete on Iran and North Korea. But those nations survive and thrive under the sanctions. So do you think this sanction will make Russia more isolated, more self-reliant, and more arrogant?
Well, I hope not the latter, but I do think that the cases that you've mentioned are very significant in comparison to this. One of the things that makes sanctions work at its best is when the country that's being sanctioned is highly economically interdependent and integrated with the sanctioners. In North Korea, that's never been the case. North Korea already was isolated economically, and while we could control or aim to control through sanctions the export of coal, the various importation of petroleum goods, and various other things, we were always sort of nipping at the edges of actually impacting North Korea economically. What we had wanted to do was to prevent the importation of goods and other things that help them build up missiles or the nuclear weapons. Those sanctions have failed. In the case of Iran, I'd make the case that sanctions were misused in a number of ways, but even with the misuse of sanctions and the maximum pressure that pulled the United States out of the JCPOA, we're weeks away from the restoration of that agreement. In terms of the economic impact on Iran, I think most middle class and working class people in Iran did get negatively impacted in ways that the sanctions were not originally meant to do. I think anytime you have a country that has a large single export product, there's going to be ways in which the sanctions will impact negatively until they can find ways to have new purchasers of their good. And this is why the Russians and the Chinese especially were able to help Iran evade the sanctions. And these were sanctions with a big leakage. The full story is yet to be written, I think, in that case. But Russia is the case that proves the rule because of the 3,000 American companies that operate in Russia, because of its substantial trade across the board in imports and exports with the West and the United States, because of the travel of Russians back and forth to the West, because the country as a centralized run economy from the top down has lots of exposure internationally in its financial assets and its sovereign debts, when you start closing down those bank accounts and changing the access of Russian banks to interact, to finance the goods that are now also embargoed, you take a big bite of an economy pretty clearly. The fall in the value of the ruble, the inflation in the country, the movement of the reserve rate for borrowing from 5% to 20% in 1 week, the closing of the Russian stock exchange, all of that we've seen only in the first 10 days of these sanctions. The implications for this down the road are pretty serious. And the personal has become political, and the political, by being an oligarch, has now gone personal, because the West is seizing luxury goods that they feel are ill-derived benefits of the corruption and the robbing by oligarchs of monies that should be in the state treasury and working for the country's benefit.
You know, scholars have theorized that if there is more trade, more business, it can help modify the behavior of the communist regime or post-communist regime or authoritarian regimes like Russia and China. Do you think that theory is facing some challenge at this moment?
Yeah, and I think the challenges began even in tensions between China and the West over the last few years. I do believe that the international research findings that say the greater the trading partners, the greater the interdependence, the greater the likelihood of peace, because when you attack a trading partner, in a sense, you're attacking yourself. That's also what makes sanctions so likely to be successful across interdependent economies. So there's much peace that's generated by increased cooperation and trade. The European continent of the last half of the 20th century shows that in comparison to its centuries before, when you went to a common market, when we have a Gulf Cooperative Council, when we have a Latin American Free Trade Association. All the old rivalries fade away and cooperation seems to rule the day. And there are ways in which Russia could have retained cooperation if it sought a diplomatic settlement to its worries about Ukraine. But when a dictatorial leader with massive state power chooses to go ahead and realize their ambitions under maybe some illusions about how his own country is so strong it can hold back the effect of the sanctions, then you have the situation we have here now.
Professor Lopez, something related but not quite. I mean, let me ask you about this. You know, while there is a huge amount of support for Ukraine, troubling news is coming out when African Union is condemning Ukraine, not allowing blacks to go out. Now reports are coming out about the Asians. So is it connected with the overall rise of white nationalism in Europe? Or is it something unique? A unique possibility comes to mind because, you know, Russia is accusing Ukraine of having neo-Nazis. Now it is confirmed that neo-Nazi militias are part of their army, although the president himself is a Jew. So what is the complexity regarding this race tension, which seems to have emerged as a substantial news in the last couple of days?
Yeah, I think it arose at the start as you had so many non-Ukrainian international students studying in Ukrainian universities and approaching the borders, whether it was students from India or Ethiopia or Egypt. There were initial difficulties at the Polish border, but they were corrected within 48 hours. What do they reflect? They reflect cultural prejudices that don't change overnight. It reflects much of what we saw in some sections of Europe in a resistance to Syrian refugees years ago. I think there is always a racial cultural element in a number of dynamics. But the word complexity that you use is so important because no society is homogeneous. No society that's a modern educating and travel society like Ukraine is, both in Ukrainians and the people they invite in to study, is going to produce a homogeneous kind of approach. But I think the adaptation and the attempt to get to our better universal values is prevailing in this case. And no migrant coming from Ukraine seems to be being stopped at the border now.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Lopez, for your time. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Glad to see you.
Thank you. Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.